Ladies and gentlemen, the In Focus sessions will start in a few minutes. Please proceed to the Moroccan tent for the In Focus on the how to promote the regional integration in Africa and for the energy mix in the ballroom. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, The InFocus sessions will start in 1 minute. Please proceed to the ballroom for the InFocus on the energy mix to promote Africa's developments. For the InFocus on the regional integration in Africa, please proceed to the Moroccan tent. Ladies and gentlemen, the InFocus sessions will start in 1 minute. Please proceed to the ballroom for the InFocus on energy mix to promote Africa's developments. And to proceed to the Moroccan tent for the InFocus on how to promote regional integration in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the InFocus sessions are starting. For the InFocus session on energy mix to promote Africa's development, please proceed to the ballroom and take your seats. For the InFocus session on how to promote regional integration in Africa, please proceed to the Moroccan tent and take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. André Caillé, board member at Junex.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. We will be discussing a very important subject, namely relative to the question of what's the best energy mix to accelerate Africa's development. Africa has all sources of energy available. Some are developed, some are not. And it is still a place and a region in the world where the question can be asked. Of course, developed countries have already made up their choice. Still room for a choice that will influence the future. To discuss this subject this afternoon, we'll have a very good panel. First, I'd like to introduce, and please welcome with me, Festa. He is at Total for gas, renewables, and power, namely Vice President of LNG Business Development. Eric, welcome. Second, we have Andreas Kraemer. He's from the Ecologic Institute. And welcome, Andreas. We also have Lighting Africa. He's in the solar business. And last but not least, Simone Tagliapietra. I hope I pronounce your name well. Perfect. He is a fellow at Bruegel. Thanks. Welcome, Akon. So, first of all, gentlemen, I'll give you 5 minutes each to give your personal views or personal opinion on the subject of our discussion, starting with you, Eric.
Oh, thank you for fellow panelists. Yeah. Will be able to to develop theirs.
Sorry about that.
But I accept that. It's okay. I accept the challenge. Thank you, dear guests. So for me, the best energy mix for Africa is an energy mix that addresses climate change without hurting prospects for growth. It's also an energy mix that ensures that everyone has access to energy and safe cooking facilities. You know maybe that in sub-Saharan Africa, there's access to electricity today. Again, in sub-Saharan Africa, 600 million people have no access to clean cooking facilities. So this is a key point that should be addressed by when thinking about the energy mix in Africa. A third point is about making sure that this energy mix benefits from advances in technology, such as solar panel, PV cells, electricity storage. So Africa should be able to leapfrog some older generation of technology by making sure that they benefit from the best technology available. Also from new business models that will enable off-grid access to electricity, for example, by the use of new technology in mobile phone, in pay-as-you-go models. These should be allowed to benefit from availability of certain sources of energy, such as gas, which is available worldwide and at affordable energy. So for me, the right energy mix for Africa in the future is a mix where coal, dependency to coal is reduced, where oil is used only where it cannot be easily replaced, and we know that there are still places where oil has to be used as the most efficient fuel, unfortunately with some impact on the climate. Third is where renewable energies are developed and continue to be developed, such as hydropower, solar, wind, and Morocco is a good example of that. With wind power and solar electricity being developed, and finally an energy mix where gas is taking more a bigger share. Gas is a reliable, affordable, and accessible source of energy. It can provide LPG for safe and clean cooking stoves. It can provide gas in the form of LNG, for instance, that can be imported in countries to provide gas for industry and for electricity generation. So this is what I see as being the future energy mix. Companies like Total have integrated climate change into a strategy. We are moving purely oil and gas companies to being an energy company, to provide solar solution, to be also in wind technology, in solar technology, bringing gas and investing in gas infrastructure where it matters most and where it can help in providing access to electricity and to energy.
Thank you, Eric. Now, the floor is yours, Andreas.
Thank you very much. And I congratulate the organizers of this panel because they've made sure that we can have a decent argument here, because I couldn't disagree more. Well, I agree with much of what you say, but I think you overestimate the future role of gas very much. At the moment is a historic event, and that is the latest experience with solar power, with PV, is we have at least 3 locations in the world, in Chile, in Mexico, and in Saudi Arabia, where solar power costs less than 2 US cents per kilowatt hour. And it keeps coming down by about 26% for every doubling of the aggregate output of that industry. The world is heading for a 1 US cent per kilowatt hour price for solar energy. For wind is not yet there. It's at the moment worldwide between 3 and 5 US cents per kilowatt hour out of wind. It is dirt cheap, if you permit me the pun. And when that is the case, why should anybody waste their good money, their good talent, and waste time on investing in fossil energy, including fossil methane? So the future energy mix of Africa, if it wants to be competitive, is a good combination with regional variation of photovoltaics, concentrated solar power with storage behind it so that it can provide electricity round the clock. The same with electricity. You have round-the-clock wind in West Africa, the strongest wind reserve anywhere in the world. You can produce electricity to power the whole of the continent and Europe to go with it, if you like, just in West Africa, a little bit south of Morocco. That is where you have the globally best wind resource. In addition to that, you do have some hydropower potential. There is a little bit of biomass that can be produced. Some regions can't, but others can. But that has the beauty of being dispatchable. So I will say assets, that's the distribution asset, the ones that can be used, because there will be biogenic gas and there will be synthetic gas that can speak the carbon dioxide out of the air with the excess renewable electricity that will be produced by solar panels and by onshore wind. Offshore for Africa is another resource that can be developed. It's not yet there, it's not yet cheap enough, but it will be in 5 years' time. So the energy mix of Africa is various types of renewables, it is storage, and it is together with smart energy management systems. And the final point I want to make is the real innovation is for rural Africa, the parts that are far away from the coastal cities where the ships arrive with the LNG, far away from the urban centers and the industries, where the rural people live that don't have electricity at the moment. Because you can buy a kit that provides you with 80 of power for $300 US. It's enough to power a family home, to provide sufficient lighting, cooling, refrigeration. A small television set can be run on it. You can cool your beer or your medicine or your food, it doesn't matter. That is what it takes. That is, you buy it once and then it serves you for a decade or longer. The battery component has to be replaced. It's much cheaper than kerosene. It's much cheaper than the other liquid fuels that you have to bring into the hinterland each time you use it, because you consume it each time. the energy efficiency that we get and the economic benefits that we get from having direct current, low voltage, not even microgrid, but off-grid. It's so cheap that that will power the future of Africa. That will be a central component because it will provide access to innovation. It's absolutely.
Thank you very much. Now we'll go. You can see we have here on the panel very opposite view of what could be the future of energy for Africa. It does hold a lot of promise, at least for our discussion, okay? But before we go to discussion, we'll go to you, to talk to us about the solar energy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I thank the OCP Policy Center and the German Marshall Fund for again inviting us here coming these past 2 years. You're right on point when you talked about the future of Africa in mixed energy. Solar energy has a lot to play in it for a lot of different reasons. The first being that it is clean. Secondly, is because Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa today, countries like my home country, we have sun 362 days out of the year. In our case, what we did, I was one of those 600 million Africans you talked about without energy. I in a household where my grandfather had to wake me up early in the morning to early, and I couldn't finish because we couldn't afford to buy the candle to finish the school. When I went to America and had an opportunity to do a few things and met with Akon in 2013, I've always carried the need to come home and contribute to what will develop my home continent, Africa. So this topic is pretty personal, as you can see. To me, it's not just a business, it is something that needs to be done to 200 million young Africans living in the continent under 30 years old. To Nairobi, I see in the rural side of the continent what the lack of energy can do. This is people who, if we don't do nothing, will pretty much live in the dark. Pretty much if you go home tonight and you turn your light on and something is wrong, everything is dark, I'm sure you're going to be calling somebody. Well, the news is that more than 600 million of those people are living in those conditions every single day in the continent, which provides lack of security, a lot of challenges, issues on business, you name it. When you don't have energy, you just don't have much, you cannot compete. And us, the children of Africa, we thought that this is a mission that we have to carry on. But the work is so big that we need mixed energy. Not everybody can do it. One group can do it at once. We need wind, as you said. In West Africa, we got a lot of it. We need gas, even though sometimes many arguments come out to talk about how clean and unclean it is. And we can leapfrog what was done in other countries and other places in the world to learn from their mistakes and bring home the best practices. That's what we try to do with Akon Lighting Africa and Solar Trade International. We thought that by the time we put a project together to a wind project or a grid project in one country, it takes us from 1 to 5 years to get something to be implemented. But those millions of people cannot wait. They need some quick right now solutions. I'm not saying quick fix in the point where we'll come, you put a light up, and then you go home, things are messed up. No. Sustainable solutions into this critical problem that we face in Africa. Because I don't see how we can develop our continent without a sustainable energy solution in the continent. We cannot compete at all. Because our young people, our children of this continent, are not in those conditions properly, studying, having the right education system that will give them the tools necessary to compete with young people in Boston, in Massachusetts, or in France, or in the Emirates. So that it becomes something that we have to carry on. So we have these 3 systems that we developed. The first one we thought was necessary is called the home systems, which is strictly on those rural areas in the villages. And it's working pretty well because millions of villages throughout 19 countries that we exist, and you're right, they are not expensive compared to buying kerosene and the safety part of it with kerosene and also the health hazards that it brings. Many of those families that are using our system are pretty satisfied with it. Second one that we have is the street light systems, which actually we do in the rural areas, but also in some cities in the continent, where the government have to pay for that. And I'll come into the details on how that works during our conversation. And the last one is the mini-grid systems that we use for, you can, 50 to 100 homes. The private sector is using it in some countries that we were testing it in Guinea Equatorial. We are getting ready actually to implement it now in Mozambique, where I was just 2 weeks ago, talking with the government to implement some of those mini-grid systems. So those are the 3 systems that we have in the continent. And then I will give some time to my colleague here to have a little time to talk so I can develop more on the next part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll do just that now. Simone, you're in the sort of energy research side of this question. So we'd like to hear you, and if interesting arguments or facts for the discussion we will have shortly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. And thank you very much to kick off this panel with this personal story, because I think this really bring us to the right level of the discussion. Before getting into the heated discussion and sometimes very ideological discussion on which kind of energy mix we need in Africa, which might even sound very theoretical, we need to understand the level of the challenge that we have in front of us. As it was said before, 2 out of 3 people living in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to electricity, and every single year in the continent, 600,000 people die due to generated the fact that people use biomass, wood, inside the house to cook. So this is the level of the human challenge. That's really what we have in front of us. And it's clear that without a solid energy development, there cannot be any sort of socio-economic quick progress in the continent. Having said that, I think that the level of the challenge is so big that we don't need to choose between renewables only or gas mainly or only. The truth, I think, between these 2 different schools of thought, I think that there is room to accommodate both kind of energy generation. And I think that we need to cover. Because in rural areas, where people in sub-Saharan Africa only have access to electricity for 25%, so only 25% of the people living in rural areas in Africa have access to electricity, it's clear that in these areas, solar, namely, will play the key role in providing access to electricity to this population. But if you look at the big urban areas, if you look at the big industrial customers, at the industries, for them, solar is not the answer alone. They need stable energy, exactly as we have in all other parts of the world, and in order to have that, you need fossil fuels, because today, for the level of technology we have, that's the only practicable way. Go to an energy-intensive industry and ask them in Europe how do they consume their electricity, how do they have their electricity from. I mean, gas is an important factor in the African energy mix. And if I have to exclude one component that we really don't want to have in the mix, that's coal. And here, I think that pragmatically, what we need, all of us, to have as a key target is to that Africa will now commit to new coal-fired power generation projects. Africa has the potential to leapfrog. To do that, we need to have a balanced position, to consider that renewables are important as much as gas is important. Otherwise, and that's now the European that talks to you, you will get into the German syndrome. So you get advices from Europe about, also from the European Commission sometimes, only to go renewables. But if you look at what happened in Germany, a country that all of us might have in mind as a green country, well, in Germany today, 40% of the electricity is generated by coal, right? So Germany, over the last years, subsidized the way it also generated very important global public goods, because of that investment, also because of that investment, mainly I would say, the cost of renewable technologies went down a lot, 80% solar, right? The cost of solar went down 80% over the last years, and that's also due to the fact that in Europe, subsidies put in place, so public money going into the subsidization of renewables helped a lot the deployment of these sources. But the Germans, for example, didn't take into consideration what was happening on the other side of the energy system, and you end up having a lot of renewables, but at the same time, still 40% of your electricity being generated from the most polluting source you can even imagine. So what we need to make sure is that here in Africa, we don't go into the same trap. And that's a potential trap, because if you look at China strategy, they are switching away from coal to gas, right, to clean up air pollution, because the difference is that we should not only focus on CO2 emissions, we should also focus on environmental pollution, right? And that's something that coal generates, gas basically doesn't, that's a fact. And that's very important to consider, because if China switches to gas, then much of that coal being mined in China could be sold in the future in Africa. So we should be very attentive about avoiding this potential risk of cheap coal from China coming to Africa. And that's a very realistic risk, because if you look, for example, one country, Mozambique, very big gas reserves, the biggest finding of gas over basically the history of the industry. But the government of Mozambique has, in its energy strategy, few coal-fired power plants. Why? Because coal comes very, very cheap from the other side. That's the risk that we need to avoid, and to do that, we need to focus in a balanced way on how to use renewables and gas. That's the paradigm, and I think we can use renewables a lot in the rural areas, where also, by the way, the big chunk of the population in sub-Saharan Africa is, and then focus on gas for urban and industrial areas. That's my view.
Thank you very much. Gas has been identified as, in many forums over the last 2 years, as the fuel, and can agree with that and can disagree with that, of course. Eric, I'd like to go directly to the subject behind the possible, gas being the fuel of transition in Africa. I mean, does Africa have the resources availability, and if developed, it really be, gas could really be the fuel of transition, as other people think for other regions in the world?
I would say yes. I mean, Africa has large gas resources, has been producing gas resources for some time, not far away from here in Algeria. Algeria has been one of the first gas producer and exporter in the world. Mozambique is going to be producing gas in a few years' time. There is gas in West Africa, the Ivory Coast, in Ghana. There is gas in lots of places. There's also the possibility for those countries which have no gas resources or do not want to get into the production of gas, to import liquefied natural gas, which is available worldwide in large quantities and at an affordable price, to be imported, and using the floating regasification units, which are being installed in some places in the world, to get access to these gas supplies at a reasonable cost, to power, to bring into power generation and to power also the industry. Because one thing that was slightly mentioned earlier on, but can defeat solar panels, is the industry. If we want to power industry in Africa, which I think Africa needs also industry and needs to develop its industry. There will not be enough solar panel, electricity generation from solar or from wind to power large industrial plants. So yes, I would say gas is a transition fuel for Africa.
Thank you.
Definitely.
I know you want to answer my questions, but before that, would you answer mine? Apparently, Africa is more exposed to climate change than other regions in the world. Do you concur with that idea or not?
No. Climate change, global overheating, acidification of the oceans, those are global processes. Any harder than any other part of the world. In fact, if you look at where the overheating goes fastest, it's the Arctic region. The further away you move from the equator, the more markedly the increase in temperature is. When you look at economic consequences, as the sea level rises, at some point Florida will go bankrupt. At some point the Netherlands will go bankrupt. In each case, it will be trillions of assets that will be lost. Africa doesn't have the assets. Economically, the damage will be done in the rich north because that is where the assets are. The human toll in Africa may be high, but that is not because the climate change particularly targets Africa or is particularly worse here, but it has something to do with the ability of African societies and governments to cope with the challenges. So they need forceful policy implementation mechanisms in order to prepare for what can easily be anticipated, because there is nothing surprising about all of that. The sea level rise, the oxidization of the soil that happens as you expose it through tilling. There are all of those things that are predictable, and you can prepare very well for it. Mm-hmm. Can I also, just for the record, say very clearly, the German energy transformation has been a great benefit to the German economy as a whole. Yes, household prices have risen, but yes, at the same time, electricity prices for industry have gone down. And we have saved so much in the import fuel bill that the German economy as a whole is better off by millions, billions of euros as a consequence of that transformation. You're right. Still use 40%.
40%.
We still use too much coal. You hear me say too much coal, and there is a great argument amongst the politicians in 2030. By 2035, 2030 is what the Chancellor said. 2035 or 2040 as the trade unions in the coal sector want. That's the range of the disagreement, and we trust, the Germans trust themselves to displace 40% of their electricity supply that comes from coal at the moment, because they know how to grow the cheap and reliable and complementary renewable energy systems. We know how to do it, and we will do it.
So you will be 100% renewable in Germany by 2030 or 2040, you said?
No, the next one is to get out. Then there is still a little bit of gas, and Putin doesn't want us to stop using his gas. There are people who say we will have difficulties until 2060 to get the transport sector can be fully decarbonized as early as 2040.
But that's because the electric system is interconnected in Europe. So
no,
you'll be
using. Sorry, Germany is exporting electricity all the time.
But you will be exporting during the day when there is sun, and you will be importing during the night from France, from Belgium, from other countries which are burning either gas or using nuclear power to generate electricity during the night.
During the night, we don't import either, but we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, okay. There's one I'd like to come back a little bit to one question, very important, I think. What is the price? What is the cost, and therefore what can we expect as price for renewables sources? It's the case for wind power, it's the case for most of them, except maybe for biomass. The cost of the peak. What's the real cost of the peak? I remember when I was the CEO of a power company, prices for wind power were higher than hydro power, but we could accept that. We could live with that. But the price of a peaking facility to use solar was very, very expensive, and put really, at the end, it put out of the market the solar power. So what really is the cost of peaking? Because it requires peaking facilities, obviously. So what's the cost?
So what determines your peak? Your cost overall is to have swing consumers. We have in Germany, again, because of the changes in the energy system and the changes, the full competition at the retail level, we have companies that are using predictions of the wind power forecast, which they use in order to predict the price of electricity. And they ramp their processes up and down, and thereby they shave the peaks, and it saves enormous amounts of money in the system as a whole. They do it for their microeconomic benefit at the company level, but it saves enormous amounts of expenditure of investment in the system as a whole. The peak is determined by the last stupid person switching on a power using thing. The more interconnection you have, the more storage you have in the system, the more flexibility, demand flexibility you have, the more you inform your electricity consumers, the better they can react and the cheaper it will be. Overall, we already know that the electricity system for Germany that is 100% renewable, doesn't have gas, doesn't rely on fossil inputs or nuclear imports from other countries. On the contrary, we're exporting, net exporter all the time. Is not more expensive than maintaining the system as a whole, as it is at the moment. The key reason for that is because wind blows in Germany, the sun shines in Germany, the rain falls in Germany. All of those are free environmental flows. The nature doesn't send us a bill. And as we save the imported gas, the imported oil, and even the imported hard coal that we don't mine ourselves anymore, we're saving enormous amounts of money in import bills. That can be replicated by anybody.
My numbers are a few years old, and they were much higher. When you're saying, in your introduction, you were talking about solar power at as less as 1 cent. Okay, if I understood well. Can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's good.
I am surprised that this includes the peaking, the necessary peaking.
No, that is the levelized cost of energy as it is compared, as it comes out of the tenders, as you feed it into the grid. So for an energy system as a whole to run, you look at the cost of interconnection, which for solar power and for wind power is cheaper than for nuclear power or for big coal-fired power plants. And you need to look at the cost of communicating in order to make sure that the system is in equilibrium all the time, it's well balanced, including the storage in it. So the total cost of as you would say, managing the system as a whole is probably 4 times as much, but it's still cheaper than the marginal cost of producing nuclear power or coal power.
Okay. So for our African friends, you got to take in consideration that the cost and therefore the price of renewables is going down, very significantly going down. But at the same time, we'll have also to take into consideration that they're not continuous sources. And so you will need to rely on a cost of which are largely capital costs. So they are there anyway. So it may be, as our colleague just said, 4 or 5 times more expensive than the renewable itself. Thank you very, very much for that. I'll come back to you. You've advanced that always relative to the same question. You've argued that maybe peaking facility, that's what I understood anyway, will be more expensive than what just been said, and in fact will represent the same cost at the time. Would you comment?
I also feel sorry to having brought Germany into the debate. I mean, I think that analyzing the microeconomics of the German energy system is not the aim of this panel, and is not an experience that can be replicated soon in Africa. If you ask me the challenge about pricing and investments, I think the key number is the following. Today, if you look at the investments being made in sub-Saharan Africa power sector, the estimations, International Energy Agency and World Bank, are $10 billion per year. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, so at the, for example, SDG 7, energy access to all by 2030, if we want to achieve that target in Africa, the estimated amount of investment requirement is $100 billion per year into the power sector of Africa, okay? So we have a gap, an investment gap, which is the key problem at the basis of the development. So we need to understand who, at the end of the day, will invest into the sub-Saharan Africa power systems. Being it gas, renewables, doesn't matter. The investments are needed, so the question is who is going to do that? The point is that being these investments requirements so large, the key role will be played by the private sector. But the private sector will not jump into these markets necessarily tomorrow for a number of reasons which basically concern governance. So we have to be clear that to facilitate the energy transition in Africa is up to the African governments. Tackle corruption, tackle the unsustainable issue of energy subsidies across the continent, where we are still subsidizing in a very strange way oil consumption and so on. Then we need very stable regulatory frameworks. And that's something where, for example, Morocco can provide a great lesson to the whole continent. Because if there is a reason why Morocco is so advanced in terms of renewable energy deployment, is simply due to the fact that the Moroccan government over the last years put in place a very stable regulatory framework for renewable energy, for instance, so that European utilities, international utilities can come to Morocco and invest and feel, for example, in other European countries as Spain, where the rules change all the time, okay? So this regulatory issue is key. Having said that, I think that multilateral development banks have also an important role to play in accompanying private investments into the African electricity system, and that's particularly the case for the investments in rural areas. Because political risk is one thing, but then you also have commercial risks. If, like it happens many times around the African continent, you are not able to get paid by your customers, then why should a private company make an investment decision? So you not only have the political risk, but also the commercial risk. You should understand how to let people pay the fair price for the electricity they consume. Because if they don't pay for the electricity they consume, then nobody will invest in strengthening and enhancing the system. And to do that, I think that digitalization can provide a great help, because all these new technologies like prepaid meters and so on can really facilitate the tackling of this challenge, which is really crucial and at the same level of the political risk as far as a private investment decision is concerned.
Yeah. Kept you for the end because you're doing it in the field.
That's right.
Yeah, and I don't want to get access to any industrial. Can you tell the audience relative to the cost for rural Africa? What's the cost, including the peaking service of solar power?
I think, you know, before we go back to the cost back and forth on what he's talking about, he's touching some point that I'm more interested in, which is the core of why Africa is in this state today. He stated that you need the private sector to come in and invest in energy in Africa. But for the private sector to invest, you have to have political leadership, but also you have to have peace and security, but also guarantee that when you invest, you will get your investments back. You to put your money in, and you know you're not going to get it back. In many of our countries, they are not stable enough to have enough investors to come in and go to the private sector and invest on energy, which is the bedrock of our economy. We can't talk about development without energy. But it happened to us in some countries, for instance. We go and invest, because in every country that we go in, including Africa, with our $1 billion line of credit, we come in with pre-financing. You sign a contract with the government, get the young people ready, you bring the materials in, you get the lines up, and then the lights are up. A year later, for example, in Benin, in our case, then you ain't paid yet. Then your investments is out in the air, which is the reason why many of us don't go too fast in investing in those countries. And why I brought in this example is because I want to make a point here. That we can talk about investments in Africa, we can talk about the energy opportunities in Africa and all that, but for me, as a young African, a young Senegalese who's traveled the world and seen what's being done in your country, and in your country, but I know that we cannot change our countries today unless we tackle our problem, which is leadership. Unless we touch the leadership issues in Africa, you can't talk about policy and the implementation of policy when you don't have leaders who are serving for the good of the people. Leaders who are making sure that when investments come in, the money don't go to channels of corruption, but there is the interest of the country at first. That our people are not educated enough. They don't have the right education to control our economy in Africa. And if you have by outside, it becomes fragile. That all these points they're selling us around the world, that Africa, 7 out of the 10 most fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. I was just in Senegal. I just landed 4 days ago, and I was traveling around Kaffrine and Nanga, those small little villages in my home cities. Those people that I met 2 days ago, they don't know nothing about these 5-7 points that the World Bank or the FME is telling us. Our economy is not inclusive. We don't control it. And our leadership do not understand that. They are not in Africa first. It's good, you can come and invest. We need that. Europe, United States came and invested after the war. You went through the same issues after the Second World War. America, this thing here, the German Marshall Fund, came and invested there to give you a push to go in. But since after the independence, we're still getting aid and push. And as a young African who's speaking, and I know for a lot of young Africans who are in the diaspora and coming home, I think the conversation has to be more into leadership. Because you can talk about energy all day, and you can talk about, I want my people to feel the investment. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And this is the core of, I know you got nothing to do with you, because you want to make sure you really want to make sure those young people in those villages living in the conditions that I was living in Kaolack, not being able to study at night, to have this light. But it will not happen until you have dedicated servant leaders, like you did in Europe, like we did in the United States.
Thank you. So what you're saying is that, and I will remember that, I'll take that with me, is that good governance, corruption, is still surface when we're talking about energy, just like if we were talking about any other subject, like we did over the last 2 days. You want to add something?
Yeah, if I may, just to underline the crucial point you are raising, the one of ownership. It's very important while making investments, even in the energy sector, to try to engage with the local communities and in order to give them the ownership about the project that you are developing. And I think that with this respect, renewable energy really has a great potential, because it's true, and we should acknowledge, I mean, that even in Europe, if you look at the solar panels that we have around, I mean, mainly they are produced in China, right? So we cannot expect Africa tomorrow to become manufacturing the solar cells, but a solar panel is not just a solar cell. So you can China, it's fine, cheap solar cell, but then you have all the other components of a solar panel that can be of a solar panel is also installation and all what comes after in terms of taking care of the installations. So there is a big potential of job creations out of renewable energy, particularly solar, in rural areas, and I think that governments should really push for this kind of new thinking about being integrated in the global value chain, not taking the full technology as it is, but really try to go more granular into the value chain and the kind of technology you need, import the one that, due to the economies of scale, you cannot manufacture yourself, and that's you should acknowledge that, as we do in Europe, by the way. It's nothing special, nothing special. But then you need to invest in all the other components that this kind of partnership with foreign companies in order to develop jobs here. That's something that governments, I think, should be very careful.
I want to jump into that point that he just made, the job creation point. When we started Akon Lighting Africa, the biggest point for me was, what can we do to make sure we allow young people in Africa to be trained and also help us to electrify the continent, to install the lights, but also maintain them. In the beginning, we start hiring them, but most of them don't have the. When we went to negotiate with our partners in China, they wanted to bring the workers to do it. But my stand was, we need a manager to help me train the young people so they do the job. It's in that conversation that we launched the first solar academy in the continent, which is today training hundreds of young people in Mali. And 5,400 of those young people are working with us today directly. Why are we doing that? And the second part, which is we just launched in January, is the assembly line. We're coming. We used to buy it in China, assemble it in China, and ship it to Africa. Now, we buy the product in China, in Germany for batteries, and a little bit with these young people in our own assembly line. There is added value to that because we have, again, millions of young Africans today with no skills and no jobs. Because of it, they're taking these boats, going to Europe looking for an opportunity, chasing a dream that doesn't exist anymore. Because we have failed leadership in this continent. The majority of our continent has failed the young people, the future, the bedrock of our future. What we try to do is to make sure we give them added value, but also we help on job creation in our project. Hundreds of them today, you've given hope in jobs. And jobs is not more than just money, it's dignity.
policy, right? Because
Always
technology
about
is
policy.
there. What you need is the sound policy frameworks
It
that
is.
can facilitate this kind of stuff.
It is.
And these policy frameworks are not there in all the countries in the continent, right?
That's correct.
We're trying to make this as much as possible a deep dive analysis in this specific, very focused subject. Are there any issues of it you would like to add because we've missed out so far?
Maybe just to continue a little bit on that point and bring a bit a touch of optimism. We've been working in Africa for many years, for probably about 40 years, and we have a presence in most African countries with also solar panels, solar solutions to small villages. We are also providing solar lamps to help people in their homes to work at night. We've been previously and still now working on producing oil and gas. We have trained people. We are employing mostly African people in the countries where we work, whether it's on our facilities or whether it's on our service stations, in our lubricant plants, etc. So we've been training people. These people are very competent. And yes, there might be some issue of governance, which in some cases prevent us from investing. But in most cases, we are able to work in an ethical way and raising the competence of people, training them, good way of life. So I think, private companies can do it if they are able to take the risk to invest in Africa. There is more risk than in other countries, maybe in OECD countries, but it works.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
very short, because we have to turn it to the floor.
Yeah. We focus on the employment, but I think it is worth repeating and reminding ourselves of the fact that electricity in the homes actually means lighting for learning. It means refrigeration for food, less food. It means that if you have a solar cooker, that you don't have the air pollution that then has this detrimental effect. But there is more to that. Current low voltage technology. There are now power tools that used to be for alternate current. They're being developed specific voltage, direct current application. It starts with the razor, the shearer that you have in order to open a barbershop, but it ends up with welding machines. 2 years ago, it was declared impossible to have a welding machine that works on direct current. Now you can buy one, which means that anybody who wants to set up a repair shop for anything from bicycles to cars to whatever can do that on the basis of off-grid, self-supplied electricity in any African village. And when you look at the innovation potential that comes from that and the job potential that is enabled by the modern form of electricity, that is much more than just setting up the panels. That's one-off, and then you have them for a decade. It's the effect afterwards that are so much more powerful for the societies of Africa.
Thank you. Maybe we can give them a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Therefore, questions from the floor. That this gentleman, you after. He's raised his hand first.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a few concerns. First of all, is the issue of Africa's development. And we know that for Nigeria, for example, where I come from, it's not so easy to have solar farms for industries. And most of them would rather rely on having gas power plants. So I'm saying somehow, because we're looking for the right energy mix for Africa, it's important that we strike the balance in such a way that we do not hamper the growth, for example, of the industries. That's my first point. The second thing I want to say is I'm glad Total is here because we have a Total filling station in Ikeja, Lagos, that is powered by solar panels, fully, 100%, and which is a good one. And thank you to Akon Lighting for all the job you've been doing. The problem that exists is still the fact that there is a huge skills gap in developing the renewable energy sector in Nigeria, for example. And so most times, the trust for energy systems has been eroded because unskilled people have installed these systems without sizing properly. I mean, without. So pitching this to you. What do you want to do in terms of bridging the skill gap in Nigeria? Do you want to look at collaborating with the government, or do you want to look at collaborating with young startups? For myself, for example, I actually train young people in solar energy systems, wind, climate change, and all the rest in primary, secondary, and universities. And we even have projects ongoing right now. Are you collaborating with the government? Because usually with the government is, a long process. Do you want to look at collaborating with young startups like Imagine Leaders that are here to make sure that you can actually push the agenda? The other question I would like to bring about is standards. Now, at the point in Nigeria, we had lots of fake solar panels and batteries coming into the country. There was no regulation. And so it wasn't about how many solar panels were coming in, it was about the quality. And then this is a big issue. So I would like to know how you work with the national government in ensuring that you can ensure that this doesn't become a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So who wants to first try to give an answer to the gentleman?
I'll try for the last question first. You talk about quality. We went to visit President Kraemer back in 2014. When we went to his house, he told us, our house, if you paid attention, all those lights you've seen are gone. They're solar lights. They sold me the project. They came from, I don't want to talk about the country, but basically, in a year, everything was gone. There's no maintenance. There's no system to take care of it. Anything they've taken the money, they're gone. What can you do to guarantee me that I will not have the same problems? Responding to the president that we are, again, children of this continent. And for too long, we've seen what's been done in our motherland. And we care enough not to bring something that be sustainable in this continent. I and Akon decided to leave our comfort in the United States, in our home continent, to bring the change that our founding fathers like Nkrumah, like Senghor, like Patrice Lumumba dreamed about. When they dreamed about a change coming to this continent for independence, they knew that was not for them. And they knew they would not finish to see the work and the dreams they had and aspirations for this great continent. But they knew there would be a following generation coming, their grandchildren, who will carry the torch proudly and will do what one you did in Singapore, like the generation of Kennedy did in the United States. And that generation is and we will not wait for anyone to do it. What we bring here is more than just stories of business or opportunities. We are here to carry on the torch. So when we come, we bring quality. To answer your second question, we partner with businesses. But when we come in with pre-financing, we go directly to the government. We cannot work in the country without a direct partnership with the government. Why is that? Because when we ask the president or the minister of finance dollars to electrify, for example, villages in their allocation budgetaire, then we pre-finance it, and then they have to cut every year or whatever we negotiate from 1 to 10 years to pay that back. And many of the small businesses cannot afford to pay that kind of money. But when we always have young people in our mind in startups. When we sign the contract, we go hire the young people in the country and partner with people like you. So we need to exchange cards when we live here. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I'd like you to conclude. Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you. You had a question. One question at a time.
Thank you. My name is Mira. I'm Kenyan, so I have a very straightforward question, I hope. for industrial energy. I think that's what you were all saying. Can geothermal do that?
Yes, in theory it can, where there are geothermal, where there is potential. I'm not saying there is potential everywhere.
But in the case of Kenya, there is a big potential.
In the case of Kenya, yes. But
Right? You want to answer?
No, I think this is one of those things that's being sold, but it's wrong. You can supply a whole industrialized country exclusively on renewable energy if you have the right mix of wind energy, some hydropower, some biomass, some storage in it, if you use demand flexibility, if you have an interconnection between the systems. Where you have industry, you also have a grid. So you can connect with sources in various places. That is why it is so important to underline that there are a number of countries that are moving towards 80%, soon 100% renewable energy. In Germany and in many other countries in Europe, we do have 100% or even more renewable energy in the grid some of the time. And of course it powers industry. There is absolutely no problem. If you have an interconnected grid, you can run your whole country, including the industry. There is a question of managing the grid and integrating enough storage facility and exploiting the flexibility.
Europe has built grids for many years. In Africa, you cannot go from the situation you have now to the situation that you explain in a decade. It's not feasible, just for the reasons of investment, of all the reasons that we explained. So you need to get a transition to get to that point in many, I don't know, in how many years, in maybe 2-3 decades before you get there. There's no grid at the moment, so solutions that we've talked about, which are off-grid, which are designed to be, in fact, the right approach and the right solution for Africa in rural places, are off-grid solutions. So just because, in fact, it's better to do off-grid than to build a grid.
Like they say in the U.S. Football, I just got the 2 minutes warning. So a very good question, please.
An energy issue in Africa. Yes. And one thing that we have here in this country, a strategy for renewable energy and energy efficiency since 2009, and we decided to give priority to those sectors. The results after 8 years, the cheapest price from wind in the world, 3 cents per kilowatt hour, coming from, and we have today a cement industry having 80% of its electricity coming from wind. So you can reach very high, not 100%, but very high of percentage of renewables because of 2 things. But there's a huge revolution, as I mentioned, about the price of renewables. 3 cents, 2 cents, 1 cent, it's something that can be. Second point, storage. Storage is also having huge revolution. And you have 20 gigawatt of solar roofs in Italy. You have these roofs to manage for the grid. The issue in Africa, the key question today, should we go for rural electrification through grids or through solar home systems? Solar home systems are becoming cheaper and cheaper because of the solar PV price, because of the storage price that is decreasing. So there is a huge revolution, and I think we can skip and we can really quickly do this rural electrification in Africa the way as you're doing, and it can be developed. Second point, industry parts of the wind are producing more today. 42% of the solar thermal plant running at night, 7 hours of storage, heat storage in melting salt, just in Ouarzazate, 200 kilometers from here. So we are reaching low price with guarantee with renewables. One day we'll reach maybe 100% of renewables. Some countries, even France, announced 2050 a study that they can reach 100% of renewables. Today, we can start, and that's why I guess also natural gas can play a role, and that we discussed during COP22, because natural gas is more flexible, and it can help when we through natural gas. Combined cycle gas power plant, it's also cheap. But for Africa, we should look we managed to have that. Of course, there is energy transition. It's not a rupture. An island, 100 kilometers from here, Spanish island today is 100% Hierro. The island of Hierro is 100% renewables because they can store and they pump water from the sea. They store energy by pumping water. That's one thing. In some cases, you can reach those amount of percentage of renewables, but you have to be careful because the key, governance, standards, training. We have a training center here in Marrakesh for all Africa. You know all these skills, and it's the key for Africa. The young people can be trained and have jobs in this field, many jobs in this field.
Thank you very much. I can miss out on you since you are my it's okay?
Yeah, well, so
yeah.
My question is very brief. I mean, great panel. I think your point on the need for private investment is the key, and for this, legal security and physical security, which are not given. But my question addresses Total. Total is not the example of the private sector. Total is a big company. No, it's too big a company. Total negotiates with governments. Total doesn't need legal security. The private sector does, in general terms. And I have a question for you. What is the World Bank not financed 2019 gas projects in Africa?
Maybe just to that, the World Bank will not finance upstream production, exploration and production of oil and gas. It will still continue to finance projects where gas is used or fossil fuels are used for power generation, for instance, or are used for bringing energy into countries where it's needed for the development, economic development. So this is just a precision.
And just also to add on this, if you talk to the World Bank energy guys about the future of energy in Africa, they are very clear in mind that the future is going to be renewables plus gas. And they are very clear in mind that the enemy is coal. We should avoid getting into this coal trap.
So thank you very much to you all. I think we've covered the subject. And I have to say I agree with most that has been said, but I will not try to resume because then I would it would take too much time. Thank you very much to the audience, and I hope we have met your standards and we have answered your question. Thank you. A round of applause, please, for the panel. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's have a coffee break of 20 minutes. We will reconvene for the last plenary of the day, which will start at